My name is Dilshanie Perera, and I am the Mellon Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow in Climate and Inequality here at the Climate Museum. And I want to welcome you to Gulf Coast Stories, an event that we hosted on January 8th, 2021. And we had a little bit of trouble with our recording for Gulf Coast Stories. So I'm here to reintroduce the event. But during the event, I had the distinct pleasure of being able to facilitate a conversation between our distinguished guests. We have artist, photographer, and writer Virginia Hanusik, and senior editor at The Atlantic and the creator of the Floodlines podcast, Vann Newkirk. And at the beginning of the show, I invited Virginia and Vann to introduce themselves and their work from the perspective of people who are creating art, creating stories, soliciting narratives about New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. And so, Virginia, I want to invite you to introduce your work and some of the themes that you deal with in your art.
Thank you so much. It's good to be back with you. Hi, everyone. My name is Virginia Hanasick. I'm an artist based in New Orleans. My work primarily focuses on landscapes impacted by climate change, particularly coastal landscapes. So I look a lot around the interactions between land and water, how we're building along the coast, interacting with that space, and what kind of symbols are in the built environment that allude to these larger societal values and issues that we're currently experiencing. So the images that you're seeing, if you attended the event prior to this with the larger slideshow, are from the past several years of me working in South Louisiana, a state that is undergoing rapid transformation in terms of land loss due to the changing of the Mississippi River, rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and a lot of manipulation of the landscape from the oil and gas industry. So a lot of my work is in, I don't want to say directly all the time, but in conversation with disaster type imagery that a lot of these spaces, particularly in this region, have been portrayed as. So I look a lot at architecture, at infrastructure, at kind of the built environment that allows these spaces to exist. And I'm really excited to be able to join Vann and speak with you all a bit more about some of the work that I've been working on, and share a bit more. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Virginia.
The last island hurricane was a Category 4 storm when it hit. It's been called the first great storm in the recorded history of Louisiana. It seems like every generation has one. 1893, 1915, 1947, each with their stories and their myths, each with their Richards. The last big storm in New Orleans was Hurricane Betsy, 1965. And then, for 40 years, it was quiet.
Katrina is turning into a monster of a storm in the very big realm.
No one seems to be taking responsibility. George Bush doesn't care about black people.
From The Atlantic, I'm Vann Newkirk, and this is Floodlines.
Katrina is turning into a monster of a storm in the very big realm.
No one seems to be taking responsibility.
I love that layered history that that we get in that clip. Dan, would you like to explain it a little bit for us?
Yeah. So what you hear in that clip, that's the prologue to the actual story. And I was talking about what was known as the last island hurricane, essentially a resort island for slave owners. And to me, the story was really potent because some of the main people, some of the only people who survived were enslaved folks who were there, who were paying attention and who knew the storm was coming and who knew how to seek shelter. And something about it, like it was really sensational. It was actually in the pages of places like the Atlantic back then. It was sensational because people were just drawn to this romantic kind of Great Gatsby story of, this was at the time the wealthiest place in America, of all these millionaires being drowned, kind of like hubris. But to me, the story was about the inherently unstable and shaky relationship of slavery to the land. And so I drew that out in the prologue. It sets the table for Floodlines, which is an 8-episode documentary about when the levees broke in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and about the lives of people who went through it and are still going through it today. I am also not from the Gulf Coast, but I think if you heard the previous session, I'm from coastal North Carolina. Have been affected by catastrophic floods. And for me, watching Hurricane Katrina on television was like seeing the country sort of become aware of the forces that had been at work in my life. And so, I felt a special kind of kinship with people who were being displaced, who were trying to grapple with how they're being portrayed and seen in the media. And it's definitely always animated my work. And coming back from covering Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, it just struck me that Katrina was and talking about families who went through it, was a perfect way for me personally to understand a little bit more about America, about where we are today. And along the way, when I was reporting out a potential story, we just came upon people whose stories were just so vibrant and necessary. And, if you listen to the show, you see we're at our best when we just give them the microphone and let them talk. That's was, the most edifying piece of this project. And it reflected in my larger work, which is on climate change and justice, working on a book on historically Black towns and climate change. Is I get to go and ask people about their lives and about how they're being affected by the biggest story, problem, issue of our time. And it's just extraordinarily gratifying. I'm grateful for it.
I think that storytelling that gets elicited from your work and also from yours, Virginia, is just so powerful. And this is sort of the perfect segue into my next question, which is that looking at your work, I am really interested in the ways that both of you push back against particular narratives of disaster, right? Like for example, the idea that disaster is natural or inevitable. And I feel that your work also challenges narratives that disavow or dispossess particular places and communities, right? Like specifically Black and Indigenous communities in the Gulf Coast and beyond. So I wanted to ask you both what you feel are the possibilities of telling stories that and highlighting the stories of people that counteract the kind of narratives that frame people and places as disastrous. Why don't we go in reverse order, Vann and then Virginia?
So I think number one, I want to rearrange slightly the question, because I think it is important to go out in this work and to purposefully challenge the narratives. And, of course, my reporting is built on that. But I also think you don't have to really build a super rigorous framework or praxis in reporting and art to do that. It is remarkable how much you'll gain that's not the official story just by making sure you talk to people who were affected by the disaster itself. You don't have to know, you don't have to have a theory like I do, which is I don't believe that, natural disasters are often natural. And I don't believe that disaster is a proper framework at all for understanding what happens when major catastrophes erupt or emerge. We think of them as discrete events that just kind of happen, they're acts of God, etc. But to me, they are culminations. And what happened in Katrina, what happened in Florida, in my hometown, they were not sudden events. Hurricanes are sudden, but what hurricanes cause is certainly not sudden. The inequalities that emerge after a flood or after a tornado or after any sort of disaster, they are not sudden and unexpected. And so, that is based on lots and lots of study and research. But I think if you just go and ask people who are trying to get back to the public housing in New Orleans and talk to them about how most of the denial for them came after Katrina, months after it, and how they demolished the big four, most of them which didn't even flood because they were out of town, then you come to a better realization of it without having to, you don't need to do years and years of study to come to that understanding. And so for me, like I get to go and talk to the people who went through these things firsthand, who are going through them firsthand, and they will tell you up front, it's not over. And it wasn't, a thing that came out of nowhere.
I love that as the entry point into those conversations, right? People being the experts of their own experience. And Virginia,
I definitely, I think a lot of what Van previously said relates to my work as well, in that disaster, the framework it's about these systems and processes that are centuries long that you see explicitly in one event, but it's not because it just randomly happened. So as a visual person, it's a challenge to be able to communicate and articulate those large, massive concepts, in a single photograph or in another piece of art. And I think what my work is in reaction to is seeing a lot in the media around trying to really create this visual narrative around climate change that is so focused on disaster imagery, that sometimes has the adverse effect of people turning off, and being fearful and kind of shutting down because of just, violence or the overwhelming visuals that they're seeing. And that's not to say that that's necessarily, a wrong reaction, but I think about the landscape of the Gulf Coast in a larger framework also of the history of American landscape art and what places we have historically valued, and that has historically not been here. You think about where I'm from. So I'm from New York's Hudson River Valley, where the American landscape painting first originated. And for me, when I first moved down here and came here in 2011, I was working for an organization that was involved in coastal restoration work. And I'm a self-taught photographer. I didn't go to school for that. It just kind of happened over the past several years of me working on it on the side. But that's to say, I saw the differences, especially in where I'm from, of what landscapes are celebrated and the effects of that. You have protected lands, you have, less, there's a connection between perceived beauty and exploitation at the canon of American landscape art that I think I am cognizant of constantly when I'm making work, and it's important for me to be able to try to unpack these systems of how this place is so vulnerable and kind of unpack that history through that lens. So of course, I'm trying to make beautiful images because I see this place as beautiful, and you know, I want there to be another visual representation that is not just flooding or disaster imagery, because as anyone can tell you who's spent time in New Orleans and throughout the Gulf Coast, it's a beautiful, unique, incredible place that can't be summarized in one picture. So I'm trying to really focus on the systems through architecture, through infrastructure, to kind of tell these stories of place. And I don't even know if I answered your question about possibilities. I'm sorry, but that's trying. I'm trying to get at that, moving away and just being more cognizant of kind of the history of how certain regions have been represented in the media and in art.
I think this is fantastic, and also hearing both of your responses, right? There's something that's very participatory, it feels, about your approaches as well. And yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit about that, right? Like when you come up with a new project, or if you go to do research in a place that might be new to you, what is your process, right? What do you feel responsible for in building relationships and telling the stories that you want to tell and highlighting people's stories?
I can go first. With journalism, I mean, I think there's a couple things, you know, you have to always have at the top of mind in any piece of journalism, and it's, you know, am I telling the truth? Which is actually a really loaded and difficult question, and also, am I, you know, you want to make sure that your work exists on a plane of rigor, which means, you know, even if you are, I don't know if there are a lot of people who believe in that journalism should be non-biased. I'm not that person. I do believe it should be rigorous, and it should question your own biases. If you are reporting and you obviously have biases, and I think you should do your hardest to talk to people who will challenge them rigorously. Beyond that, I think you really nailed it with the participatory aspect. For me, when I'm going out and doing projects in places where I'm not necessarily familiar, well, number one, you know, there's no project until I'm familiar. And that's a big deal for me. But also that process of becoming familiar. The first question that I ask people is, what story do you want told? What story do you think is important? What do you think media on this particular topic has missed? What do you think it's done well? What do you wish it had done otherwise? And I mean, that's the basic guiding ethos of Floodlines is so many people told me that the ways that the media got it wrong, that they were still unhappy and stung by. And that kind of formed the core of what we were doing. And, you know, and then I talked to people who felt a whole lot of lack of closure in certain places. And for me, you know, I mean, it's a documentary, and documentaries have their own inherent value, but I took it as a submission of the documentary to try and provide at least some form of information that wasn't available to people before, that if it didn't provide closure, helped people navigate, help people who were, you know, we were lucky to have them share their lives with us, help them navigate better questions that they had about the disaster and the aftermath. And that's something I hope to, I try to take over in all my work.
Van, can I quickly follow up with you about, I'm thinking about the last episode of Floodlines, where you really get into these questions about acknowledgement and apology, coming from the ex-director of FEMA. And so for you, what work does acknowledging past wrongs, past harms caused by policy, by the US government, by a history of racial inequality in the US. What work is acknowledgement doing for you?
I mean, I don't want to spoil the last episode of people who haven't listened. I interviewed FEMA Chief Michael Brown. He does acknowledge some things that he has, been a little slow to acknowledge before. It's not a clean apology in any sense, but it is something, I think. If you listen past that, I think you'll see that acknowledgement was important to people who shared their stories. And that's that's value on its own to me, but it's also valuable in our collective understanding of what disasters are and why we memorialize them in the first place. For me, it's very, I look at all the histories of disasters in America, and it is so difficult to find any real culpability in our histories of them. I think about the Great Mississippi Flood in 1927, which, is another Gulf Coast event, and which destroyed the lives of hundreds of thousands of sharecroppers up and down the Mississippi River. And nobody took any responsibility for that, for what happened to them, for levees being sabotaged, for them being placed in work camps. And, I kind of subscribe to W.E.B. Du Bois's thoughts on this. What we do is not necessarily for changing the present. What we do is to create a record and for posterity, to make it so when people do want to know what happened, they have access to material that was as true as possible.
Thank you for that, Van. And Virginia, I want to open the floor to you as well to talk about your research project. And then I'm going to add another question just about how you would characterize your personal or political commitments that drive your work.
Yeah, I think my practice is different in that I don't consider myself to be a photojournalist or a documentary photographer. In that I think there's a concept of truth that is connected with that work, and I try to come at things as being more speculative or understanding, figuring out new ways of seeing these massive concepts that we are that are talked about every day in the media. So, my projects, especially in Louisiana, I'll talk about that one first. I have been working here for the past several years, and the relationships that I've built take time. And I think it's very important to be aware, especially as someone that's not from here, to recognize the history of exploitation by the media and by other artists, and helicopter journalism that has these one-off stories that don't necessarily get at the crux of what's going on, and how could it, because it's not a it's basically clickbait. So I think that it's important to build those relationships, understand the history of the context and the community that you're working in. That takes time. Otherwise, the art is basically you and your own judgments and conversation, and that's not interesting or necessarily, I think, beneficial, especially, I don't think so, but I am working also currently, I have a fellowship right now, which is about the history of river control along the Mississippi and thinking about the various ways that that landscape is manipulated and the history of flooding and disaster, and really challenging the concept of what is there anything that can be called a natural disaster right now? And as climate change makes flooding more common, what communities are going to be bearing the brunt of that increased risk? So for projects like that are larger in geographic scope, I spend a lot of time, I primarily try to reach out to organizations and other writers that I know have been involved in this work before and are much more knowledgeable than I am. And you know, it's a long research process for me, and being able to be well versed in the histories of these places. So the community engagement aspect of that, you know, it's not necessarily where I'm going out and talking with people that I see on the street, especially now. Making work in this past year has been difficult, because when I am out photographing, I do make it a priority to speak with people and engage in that way. And also the dissemination of the work, you know, I'm intentional with where the photographs are shown, and in pairing them with different articles. I think that's important as well. So yeah, that's kind of how I operate in a public engagement way. But politically and personally tied to the work, you know, like I said, I spend a lot of time with folks that are in the climate space, and being unable to, I'm not a climate expert, but I come at these issues from, you know, oh, this is something that's interesting to me and that I don't really understand, like flood insurance. And, you know, it sounds boring to a lot of people, but obviously that's going to be the defining thing in the coastal region for the next 10, 15 years, of when FEMA changes their maps and who's able to afford flood insurance and what that's going to look like. So that's kind of how that's how I approach these things, of asking these questions of, you know, I certainly don't understand, how can I better assist with communicating these things visually and making it something that you know, someone may want to learn more about. And that's not necessarily always like aerial imagery of the coast and like beaches disappearing, which I think have a use in certain contexts. But I was also re-listening to Floodlines, and in episode 3 talking about Bush, the flyover, and just this concept of aerial imagery and the disconnect and judgment that I think can sometimes be a product of that. So it's important for me to try to have another sort of visual documentation.
I have to thank you both, because your work really gives us new ways of seeing, right, and ways of accessing the past and retelling those stories. And I think you both are highlighting, again, the participatory aspects and the ways that, you know, the work is co-produced among multiple people, right, like a deep engagement to various spaces and places. And Vann, I wanted to give you a chance to answer the question of just personal and political commitments that drive your work as well.
So, you know, for me, first, you know, I have I think a series of rings of commitments. My first commitments to my family, and to my community. And being that, you know, I'm from a community that is deeply affected by, immediately by climate change, that goes a pretty long way. You know, and then I believe I have a duty to people of color. I have duty to Black folks. I have duty to people who, you know, are from contexts that are similar to our own, but may not have the same sort of opportunities or resources to carry out the sort of storytelling that I do. And so that's, you know, those are my politics, in as much as they appear in my work, because, you know, I, like I said before, I don't think journalism needs to be unbiased or apolitical. I just think you need to it's challenge what makes you and what you believe in everything you do.
Thank you for that. We're getting a question from the audience, which is, what advice would you give to someone who is a young writer, artist, or podcaster who might be starting out and who wants to maintain, you know, a similar kind of focus on climate and inequality and an orientation toward justice? And then I'll tack on to that, you know, what do you hope the audience will carry forward after this conversation, hearing your words and engaging with your work? Virginia, we can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I will answer this to the fullest extent as Vann. I feel like I am still, you know, learning as I go, and I think for me, not being professionally trained in the arts and coming at it from my background is in architecture and environmental studies, went to a liberal arts school, but so for me, I've always been interested in this work, and the artistic component really came from me needing to having this desire and curiosity to understand these landscapes that were so new to me and that I was working in, and really being able to visualize these complex issues. I would say, you know, when I was first starting was the relationships that you build with people to maintain them. And I have folks that I've met in, you know, 10 years ago that first took me out to the coast, and I still talk with them. And it's, you know, important for me as I'm making the work to understand, as Vann previously mentioned, similarly, you know, what stories you feel aren't being told, or what is your opinion on this sort of representation, or what do you want to see? So I did a lot of, you know, there was a lot of solitary type portfolio building in the beginning, and I kind of would just send it out to publications or you know, photography websites or magazines, and whomever would look at it, and just kind of tried to hustle that way. But I have always had that climate and inequality focus to my work, just because of my academic background and my primary interest. So I would say, like, the artistic component is the vehicle in which that's released. But yeah, I mean, I'm still learning as I go, and you know, a lot of my work resonates more, I found, with kind of the academic climate community, and not so much the fine art community. And I think that that's telling, in that climate stories are not necessarily seen or given like that same sort of value. So I'm looking forward to being able to hopefully change that with my work, with other people's work. And yeah, so I definitely hope and encourage you to continue with what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Virginia. I really feel that your work is doing that transformative work. So thank you so much for that. And Vann, what would you like our audience to take away from this conversation?
I think, you know, I think we should take away, I don't know. I mean, I guess what you take away is probably an answer. I'd like to answer that question about young people getting started. So I think that's what you take away. I think this is obviously a very exciting area of study, of journalism, of art, but it's one where there isn't a very high barrier to entry, I believe. It is the margins, the places where this is happening, the places where climate crises are, taking place, they're all around us. If you look at a map of America and look at landfills in America, and 2/3 of them are in communities of color, you probably live within 15, 20 minutes of one of these places, one of these hazardous waste landfills. And I guarantee there are people there who are not happy with it. And so you have a story. And this is true, if you live within an hour of a coast or a river, there are stories near you. There are pipelines crisscrossing this country over and over again. And so for me, it appears on the outside as if it's, a difficult field to be in and to get into. But actually, I believe it's one where we haven't really tapped 98% of all the environmental injustice and climate injustice stories that are taking place. And you can find them just by driving out.
I think that is a fantastic place to end our conversation, right? To really look around us and see what are the stories that are happening in our communities, right? What are the climate/inequality tales that we can tell and really bring to the fore. So I want to thank you both so much, just really deeply and sincerely for the gift of your work and for sharing your perspectives and your process and your thoughts with us today. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you. And
thank you for having me.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Hopefully everyone can join me in thanking Virginia and Vann. And this concludes this event, Gulf Coast Stories. I want to thank everyone for being here today and for your attention and for learning together with us. I encourage you all to take what you've learned and to talk about it with your friends and communities, and to join us again for continued conversations, second Fridays at the Climate Museum. And you're able to sign up now for February's discussion event, which is called Talking Climate Grief. And that'll be on February 12th next month. So we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again and take care.